locked briefcase, you mean?
What if the dog's like clearly hinting on the briefcase? Like if they have a dog?
Ah, I don't think under the automobile exception they can put a dog in the car. Campbell, that's a very interesting question. Has anyone had a search and seizure where they put the dog in the car? So that's a good question. You know, clearly, you may have all come off flights here and in other countries where they do have drug sniffing dogs as you walk through the customs area. And that has been established by federal law, who handles our, you know, transportation between countries. So, but that's a good question. My answer to you would be no, I don't think so, but I will look that up. Okay, so let's move on to the Miranda warning. Okay, we all know you have a right to
remain silent.
Yeah, it's right up there, right?
Right to an attorney.
And the right to an attorney. And the third thing that I didn't put up there is the long sentence. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. So, you know, you don't have to say anything without getting an attorney. Remember that. Okay, that's one of your rights, all of our rights in society. So, and where does the attorney come from if you can't afford one?
Public defender.
Public defender's office. That's correct. Okay, in fact, I'll add that up there before I post it. Now I say balance here. What? Oh, I should have moved balance to the next slide. I'll do that. We'll come back to balance. Hang on. Because I was modifying this morning in a hurry. Okay, trial by jury. That comes from the Sixth Amendment. Now, there's been a lot of cases that went up to the Supreme Court. What is a jury of our peers? That's what we hear. Imagine it's a Black defendant with an all-white jury. Is that truly a jury of peers or not? Without going into all the detail of a jury of peers, I'm just telling you that's a societal and case law question that has gone up to the Supreme Court many times. It is supposed to be drawn from your community unless it's such a highly sensationalized crime that you cannot get an unbiased jury. Did anyone see, in regard to which alleged crime, there is now going to be a trial? They just came out with it today. Do you remember George Floyd?
Yeah.
That officer that put his foot on that man's neck while he begged for his mother and was dying and held it there how long? 8 minutes, something horrifying, right? While he suffocated to death. And what had he done? Did he steal something worth $2 from the liquor store there or something?
It was a fake bank note that they suspected.
Nothing was violent about that. Nothing was violent about the quote underlying crime.
Nothing was worth to die for.
That officer had no right. He used the death penalty. Remember, I said to you, the officers actually carry the death penalty with them every day because they have weapons. But I mean, he used his foot. The other thing that I will tell you that may come out of his trial, so we'll watch his trial together and I'll give you updates as we go along, as it proceeds. Obviously, it was a highly sensationalized trial. If I had to be the public defender of the officer, a case I would not take, so he can allege that there won't be an unbiased jury, probably, okay? Because of the issue of it's such a sensational crime, and they will ask them in the jury box, Have you been following this case? Do you know about this case? It's hard to believe there would be anyone in America that wouldn't know about the case. Look what it led to. The entire Black Lives Movement started at that moment. So there is always that question, is it truly a jury of peers? And they do also ask you in the jury box, you know, for example, have you had anyone killed in a crime? Have you had any inappropriate treatment by officers? They will ask the people in the jury box those kinds of questions. Each side has a certain number of, what's the right legal term? Why can't I think of it? I'll use the word dismissal for the moment till it comes to me, right? So they can say, no, that juror we don't want. And I think they have 3 without any reason. And then they can, for reasons. I had a funny thing. I was in the jury box and all of a sudden the judge stops the whole proceedings. The attorneys are there, the defendant, everybody's there, stops. And he looks at me in the jury box and he said, do you drive a little white sports car with a personalized license plate in our same community here? And I said, yes. I couldn't believe the judge was asking me this. Immediately, the attorneys on both sides said, dismissed. And that was the end of me being in that trial. I have been a juror. Have any of you been jurors on a crime? No?
Soon.
So you have, Tony?
Yeah.
What was the crime?
This one, in layman terms, she pepper sprayed her husband.
Okay, she pepper sprayed her husband. I see.
They said it was back in San Diego. They say illegal use of pepper spray. So yeah.
Wow, that's a wife that was really mad.
Yeah.
That was a
They got
bad,
into like,
bad domestic fight.
yeah. To me, I don't know. It just to me, like I feel like she was within reason to spray, and it was like they came to court every day, husband and wife. So I was like, why are we even having this trial?
Because the district attorney is the one that decides, not the husband.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I found mine was a federal crime. It was bank robbery. And this was before I went to law school. I found that so much evidence was excluded that it was like having a puzzle with a third of the pieces missing. And it really shook me to my core, having that responsibility. It's a hard, very hard responsibility. All right, then we know defendants cannot be compelled to testify against themselves. That comes from the Fifth Amendment. I want to tell you about one last case, just so you know, this is a California case. And so imagine a Hispanic farm worker in the Santa Barbara area. The police, meanwhile, unbeknownst to this individual who does not speak English well, are waiting in the dark in a particular place where they think a major drug deal is going to go on. It's a sting operation, right? So they're waiting. This poor farm worker who has his machete with him rides his bicycle through that area. He was shot 8 times. He did not die, but he became blind and paralyzed. This is a recent case, maybe 10 years ago, which is recent to me. I mean, the police were scared of the machete, which was not in his hand. He was riding a bike. The worst part of it was when they realized their terrible mistake, they started interrogating him and pressuring him while he's lying there waiting for the ambulance to admit his guilt. Are they allowed to do that under the Constitution? No. He wasn't told he had the right to an attorney. He wasn't told his Miranda rights. Then in the ambulance, an officer got in with him and continued to try and interrogate him and coerce a confession out of him. The only time this conduct stopped was when they got to the hospital and the doctors said, no, you cannot speak to him anymore. He's in critical condition and we have to take care of him. So that was a case that did ultimately go all the way up to the Supreme Court about how police cannot coerce a defendant to confess that way. So they can't get an ambulance with you when you're wounded and in horrible pain and try and get a confession out of you. So you get an idea of the line of cases that go up to the Supreme Court about what can and cannot be done under criminal procedure. All right, and the balance, we are always in this, what are the courts weighing? Let's think of the ethics and social policy that underlie this, right? They are weighing society's need to enforce the law, right, against the criminal suspect's constitutional rights. Even criminal suspects and defendants have due process rights. I've listed them out for you here. And that is purportedly to prevent law enforcement abuse. But we have seen the George Floyd case. Do we really need a case to go up to the Supreme Court to say you can't put your foot on someone's neck for 8 minutes while you watch them die? It's just, unbelievable. Okay, sorry that I'm sniffing. I might have, oh, here's some Kleenex. Okay, any questions about this so far? Who could tell me the balance that I just said? Because that's important. That's one reason we go into this area of law. Part of it is to inform you about your own rights. Part of it is because it's a gray area in society to pay attention to. There can be abuse. But what is it balancing? Who wants to go ahead and reiterate it?
It's the balance between society's need to enforce the law and then the criminal suspect to get their constitutional rights.
Yes, very good answer. Always. Okay, we're now going to move this discussion into crime and people in business. Okay, this is what we call white collar crime. And so when we think about those federal prisons, those country club prisons that we talk about, typically the people there are nonviolent offenders of federal law. Okay. So you notice the word nonviolent is in business crimes. Now, I don't know if you knew, maybe you were young, 10 years ago, one of the pharmacists at Long Beach Memorial came in and murdered his direct boss and his boss's boss. And the whole hospital was on lockdown. It was a very big case. Then he committed suicide. This is when something is very bad in the workplace. You have to think, what? Anyway, that would be murder. If he had lived, he'd be charged with murder because that's not a nonviolent business crime. Also recently, someone I knew got murdered in a partner dispute in a Long Beach law firm. One of the partners got murdered. The partner that was being dismissed came in with a gun early in the morning and shot his other two partners. One died, who lived right over here near me, and one lived. So there are these, quote, workplace shootings. They would be under normal state law violent crimes, okay? So our definition is nonviolent business crimes. We're going to move immediately. I'm going to modify your syllabus because I'm changing 2 topics. And we're going to be doing securities law. And that's a big area. That's probably the biggest area of white collar crime prosecution by the federal government, by the Department of Justice. And it would be anything from the mortgage meltdown that we saw in 2008, or the Enron case. Those were all examples of financial fraud. And later on, we'll talk about bribery. I think I told you my academic papers were anti-bribery, anti-money laundering, comparing the European Union and US law. There are some antitrust criminal cases that we'll talk about when we get to that area of ethics and law. And there are some environmental cases also that are criminally charged, because we've got to stop people from dumping their hazardous waste in our water and ground and disposing of it properly, which I'm not 100% sure, based on, I think I told you my sister's an environmental attorney, what properly actually means, but it definitely means not the drinking water of the local community, which business was doing. Okay. One of the problems with charging people for business crimes is the intent, right? Remember, we have to always show either criminal intent or a high degree of what?
Recklessness.
Recklessness, like drunk driving, right? A lot of times in corporate crimes, like let's say there's one case in your book that we'll go over. Let's imagine that the CEO says, what does Wall Street think we're going to make this quarter? And the chief financial officer says, Wall Street says 10 million. And then the boss says, how much did we make? 9 million. And the boss says, plug it. These are actual words of the case we're going to discuss. Now, he didn't say falsify financial statements, right? He just said, plug it. The CFO then went back and falsified financial statements so it looked like they made 10 million. This is a crime. You go through who had the intent to commit that crime, right? I will tell you the person that did get convicted and spend time in jail, I've heard him speak, he's out of jail now, was the chief financial officer, and the CEO did not get convicted. And you see that time and time again. What is not an excuse to a crime?
My
My
boss.
boss. Go ahead, Campbell.
Your boss told you to, or
Right.
I didn't know.
Right? So the CFO, that is never a defense. That is not a legal defense to a crime. So it's hard when these kinds of crimes occur. And I gave you an example. And in fact, I'm going to give you that Rini assignment at the end of class today. Where are we on time? Yeah. Who had the specific intent? Now let's imagine in these cases something else happens. And this is Enron or Health South, the case you're going to read. And here's what happens. The CFO goes back and he says to the single mother who's working on accounts receivable, we need to show more receivables because we need to show 10 million. I expect you to make up some invoices to show that. And there, the little single mother is. She needs that job. She's supporting children, right? There she is feeling, I need this job. Uh-oh. Maybe I better do it. And her signature is right there. When it goes to court in front of a jury, they're going to be holding up that invoice with her signature on it. Did you complete this fake invoice? That's your signature. Where's the CEO's signature? It used to be nowhere. And I'll tell you how the law changed that after some of the cases that went up. Because, you know, the lower level people were being prosecuted and convicted, and the higher level people were not. And because they had the money for the very best attorneys, and you can just imagine the whole situation, how it unfolds, right? All right, so there is always that problem with individual liability, because let's look at the accounts receivable clerk. Did she really have criminal intent? The fact her boss told her to do it, you know, is not a defense, but it could be a defense that she didn't have criminal intent. And so that's the gray area that would come out in the trial. However, remember my red flags: lying or cheating in any way is probably both an ethical wrong and potentially a legal wrong. So it's not something that you want to be doing, right? She knew she was creating false financial documents. That much she did know. So, all right. So that issue of criminal intent. And there's also an effect of group decision-making. So typically in corporations, I don't know how many of you have as your goal to go out and work in a corporation when you graduate. But a lot of times decisions are either made in a hierarchy, as we just saw with this Health South case I'm going to have you read. Other times, like we saw in Pinto, decisions are made in a committee. And so people feel like, well, everybody else was going to go along with it. So what difference would my opinion have made? It's very easy to come up with a rationalization. Rationalizations are not defenses under the law either, right? So, but we do use them. Most people who do commit crimes do not think they're bad people. Okay, they think, well, you know, I was kind of coerced into doing it, or who am I hurting anyway? Especially with financial crimes, your victim is out in the general population, your, you know, potential shareholders, existing shareholders, and so forth. But you and the banks and others to whom you are lying, but you know, you don't see your victim, and they're not experiencing physical harm. So it's easier to rationalize your wrongdoing. Any questions on the complexities of criminal intent in white collar crime, business crimes? Okay. I see you smiling, Tony. Are you looking at something else or responding to what I said?
No, I have so many, but I was just like, I'll just probably catch you in office hours.
Okay, I like talking to you in office hours. It brightens up my day. And that goes for all of you. Okay, so with that background, we're now going to move into more details about white collar crime. For the assignment on Thursday, we are talking specifically in the area of criminalizing safety violations. So there's two areas of safety in terms of our right to be free from risk of serious bodily harm. Okay, that's one of our rights. Okay. One is workplace safety, and one is consumer safety. We covered consumer safety with Boeing and Takata. We're now looking at a real case that involves workplace safety. Now, you're assigned the California dairy case. I'm not going to go into the details now because I expect you to do that in your critical thinking on the assignment. I'll answer questions about the assignment, and we'll come back and talk about it more after you've all submitted your assignment to the Dropbox. All right, so typically a worker's death would be a workers' compensation death, and the family members would get workers' compensation benefits. Occasionally, it could be a personal injury lawsuit. For example, a piece of equipment they're using on the assembly line malfunctions and someone's fingers are amputated. They may be able to sue not just their employer for workers' comp, but the manufacturer of that piece of equipment. So remember in B, when you are reading the two cases I put up for you about the dairy case, remember the role of occupational safety and health. Remember to list them as a stakeholder, and remember to talk about them in terms of systemic issues of government, right? They would appear in both of those places. Now, criminal penalties for, quote, willful violations are felonies, which willful meaning criminal intent, or recklessness so high it substitutes for criminal intent. And it can be sentences up to 10 years, all right, typically now. Periodically, we see laws brought up in the legislatures of the states specifically, including our state, because we have such a large agricultural industry and a large construction industry. And in both those, and we have the port. And in all three of those industries, we have a lot of injuries. In fact, I know someone, a young man, he has 2 children, and he was working in the Long Beach port. One of the cranes, things slipped away and landed on his head. Will never work again. He's still rehabbing from his brain injuries. I mean, these are hazardous occupations, right? And the people that often are working in our most hazardous occupations are the poorer people, and which are a lot of the times minorities, as he was. And so, it is very important in these industries that there be safety, and there are safety regulations adopted, but if they're not implemented, if they're not used, what purpose are they? All right, so the 2 areas that are gray areas, so they're bringing up all kinds of ethical challenges, pro and con, or should we criminalize product liability in a degree of, high recklessness, like a Takata airbag case, because accidents will happen. Life is full of accidents. If you've implemented all the safety measures and someone dies, there's a calculation in California. The high rises in downtown? Did you know 1.6 people die for every high rise we see in the construction of it? And we know that happened. I mean, that's it. That's the average. 1.6 people die. So, what can we as a society do to try and prevent those workplace deaths? All right. Why am I losing my voice? So, as we leave this area, which is meant to support your work in the dairy case, right? Culpability. That means, who knows what culpability means? It means the same as potential liability or potential legal responsibility, criminal responsibility, perhaps. Intentional acts, right? Intentional acts, the criminal intent has to be proved for the crime, and other elements of the crime have to be proved for the person to be convicted. And the jury is given those instructions. In other cases, as I said, high degrees of recklessness, such as vehicular manslaughter, you don't intend, in the dairy case, The dairy farmer is not intending to kill 2 of his employees. Think about that, though. And then we have surely accidental negligent acts. So in terms of the mental state of the potential criminal defendant, there's intentional acts, highly reckless acts, and accidental acts. Any questions on those states of mental culpability under the law? Okay. Make sure, of course, you're talking about these things in your case. All right. So a summary of legal ethical implications. Remember, I put this slide up and adopted this slide to make it clear to you for your own knowledge and for, potentially questions on both the final exam and here the midterm. Who brings the case? So we're comparing. In a criminal case, government brings the charges, usually a prosecutor. In a plaintiff case where you're just suing for what?
Money.
Money. Civil cases are only for money. The injured plaintiff, it could be a consumer or a breach of contract lawsuit. I don't teach you the ethics of contract law. I find other areas of ethics to be more interesting than that. But there are a lot of contract lawsuits. I think I told you, they are the most common lawsuits. And in fact, I saw a lawyer at a car event. I was with my husband this weekend, and he said, we can't get any of our civil cases in because criminal cases go first. So the courts have to take criminal cases first because there's limitations on the prosecution. So you don't keep the criminal suspect or defendant in jail, by delaying the trial over and over again. It has to move forward. It takes precedence over civil cases. And when the courts were closed due to the pandemic, the criminal cases got all backed up. So it's taking time for our society to catch up. All right, the outcome for a criminal defendant in a criminal case, potential prison. And we have all those due process rights, much more due process on the criminal side because of the potential loss of liberty. And in the case of the death penalty, of life. And there was someone just executed. I think a woman was just recently executed. I don't know if you saw that in the news. I'll look up what state that was. Our state, as liberal as we are, we still have the death penalty. And it can only be overturned by getting our legislature to overturn it. So we need to think about that, the ethics of that as members of society. All right, the level of proof we talked about in a criminal case, very high, beyond a reasonable doubt. I would tell you, for my purposes, 99%. In the jury instructions, the judge will never tell you a percentage. He will just tell you it has to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, and it's up to the jurors. Think about that. The proof in a civil case for money is a lot less. It's called the preponderance of the evidence. What did I tell you? That's what percent? Come on, you know. Did you write it down?
I think it was like for like civil cases, it's more than 50% or something.
51%.
Yeah, 51. Yeah.
More likely than not, sometimes the judge will give you the instruction if it's more likely than not that the defendant did this civil wrong. And like, let's imagine you have an unpaid bill or you are a tenant. This is another thing he said that is a societal problem in my view, may not be in your view. Now, I do own an apartment building, so full disclosure of information. There are people that can't pay rent right now. So many people lost their jobs and they can't pay rent. And so California has put in that landlords cannot evict them at this time. This eviction, and I'm not an expert in eviction law, but this eviction, what word would I use? Putting it on hold, is due to end. And the landlords are all lined up. There is going to be a flood in our courts of eviction cases. And what are the ethics of that, right? That's very complicated. Landlords have to pay their mortgage still, even if tenants aren't paying rent, right? You can imagine for my husband and me, eviction is not going to be something we do. But, you know, we can still pay the mortgage on the apartment building. There are those that cannot, and these rents were meant to be their retirement. So I'm not saying one way or the other, you know, there's arguments on both sides. I'm telling you where I am, but I understand the arguments on the landlord side. So, you know, let's watch for that. That's a real ethical challenge in our society right now. And they will be civil cases, of course. All right, the mental intent. Remember capacity, we talked about that at some length, right? There has to be a criminal intent or high degree of recklessness. On the civil liability, it can be an accidental harm. Even if it's intentional, it's only about money. The criminal side, more due process, that's all that 4th, 5th, 6th Amendment stuff we went through. Civil side, less due process, because we're only talking about people's money and loss of money. We're not talking about loss of liberty. Okay. Now, one last slide here. This is a case for which I will hold you responsible. You can know it as the peanut case. Okay. So this will remind you of the dairy case, right? So people were being poisoned by salmonella, which is a horrible bacteria, in peanuts. And so it began to come out, you know, in the hospitals and more. So, something must be going on in the peanut industry. So researching back and so on, they found that these executives knew there was salmonella in their big vats of peanuts in it. I mean, think about it. We are completely relying on our food suppliers to keep us safe, right? Both in, you know, the farming and the processing and everything else that goes into making our food. Even if someone makes a mistake, we can be food poisoned and killed. But in this instance, they did find a high degree of recklessness with the high, and here the high level executives got sent to jail. He got the longest, this was in Georgia, I think. The longest executive sentence was 28 years because they knew and released the peanuts anyway. Okay. So these recalls where they say, don't buy the lettuce from such and such, from date this to date that, right? We've all heard them. They are required by federal law, if they know, to do that. Once they find out, there's the issue of disclosure. Like, when does the food producer realize or know that they have the salmonella problem? You know, I think on a personal level, in terms of ethics, as soon as they suspect, they should disclose. This is not something we want them spending months to investigate. And you see, I mean, this is 9 people died, 700 sickened from that one peanut plant. So you do need to know this case. And remember about the intent was proved by a high degree of recklessness. Obviously, the peanut executive did not intend to kill those 9 people, but there was a high degree of probability. He was very reckless that people would be sickened and some of those would die. All right, and then this just sums up everything that you already know. You've got the dairy case to think about, and as a society, ethically, we need to think about, should in some cases where the recklessness is so high to substitute for intent, should executives be liable for murder? I believe in the Takata airbag case, the Japanese executives that were convicted of fraud, not manslaughter. Because they, remember, defrauded the consumer, defrauded Honda and the others, and so forth. Any questions generally on white collar crime?